All right, thank you. I want to welcome you all to the 16th Annual Undergraduate History Showcase. This has been going on since 2008. It was started by our chair and now retired colleague Mark Traugott. And it's been a wonderful annual event for us to recognize some of the great research that our undergraduate students are doing, as well as the mentorship that some of our faculty are doing with them as well. This is a year in which I get to say that the history department absolutely swept divisional awards. As the undergraduate director, I'm on the committee that makes those decisions, and I was almost embarrassed at how much we took. We took 10 out of 11 awards, I think. And so I was almost embarrassed, but honestly, I say this to everybody, and I genuinely believe it. The history major is the best major on campus. This is the major that understands what undergraduate education is, about the opportunities to do research in close consultation with faculty, and about the opportunities to get a broad education in areas across the campus that make you even stronger historians. So while I sometimes say that history is the best major with a slight grin on my face when I'm talking to colleagues in other parts of the campus, I genuinely believe it, and I'm really grateful that you're all here to have done that. And I hope, certainly by looking at the research that you all have done and that is going to be presented to everybody here today, that you all share my appreciation for the work that everyone has done. This is a wonderful event, so thank you all. We do have a YouTube page in which you can see many, I don't know if all the way back to 2008, have all of our department showcases been featured?
I think we have about at least the past 6 years on our website.
Right. So you can go back and see those. And those of you who are presenting today, you will be available for years to come in that new permanent medium called digital something. So anyway, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with our presentations today. We're going to start with a presentation by Ian Doyle, who won both the Department Linda Peterson Award and the Hitchcock Award for the History Department, a Chancellor's Award, and a Dean's Award as well. So this is a big sweep. Ian will be graduating this quarter.
Yes.
Did this work with our ever popular Bruce Thompson, and Ian will be presenting his work, Red Dawn over Derry, A History of Socialist Republicanism and Radicalism in the Troubles.
You guys should have All right, let's see if I remember how to get it going. You said long, right? Is that it? No. Oh, it is? Oh, okay. It's different on the screen. Well, hello. Thank you all for giving me a chance to talk about my paper. It's 47 pages long, so I'll try to stuff this into 5 minutes. But yeah, so going into modern Irish history, the seminar, I knew I wanted to write about communists and the IRA. I had some vague idea that that existed, but I didn't really know that much about what that meant. So I really tried to go in just trying to answer the question of how they reacted to the Troubles, how they were influenced by it, and also sort of how they influenced the Troubles, in hand. And to do that, I really wanted to get into their heads and see what they were thinking on their own terms and sort of move beyond this predominant historical narrative of them as sort of simple terrorists. So again, my paper is really long, so I'll give you some incredibly brief context. The IRA starts as a militant nationalist organization, and the IRA that really persists after Irish independence in the 20s is one that is defined by splitting off from sort of the main group and rejecting negotiations. So they really maintain the organization by abstentionism from elections. It becomes a really big contentious thing, but also just seeing an armed struggle as the only way to, the only path to Irish liberation and uniting the island. So the bulk of the paper really focuses on the Troubles and the IRA's leftward swing in leadership in the early 60s before them, which kind of culminates in the provisional IRA split in 1969. I don't really write about the provisional IRA so much because they're really the organization that most people come to know as the IRA. It really defines the IRA and the Troubles, and most people think of the Provost. But they split off to sort of maintain this traditional sort of nationalism that had just kind of been this blanket Republican ideology of the IRA that had led to these sort of different patterns in ideology over the years. And they wanted to stick with that as opposed to the sort of new leftist leadership. And while they were not great, and they ended up having their own sort of a leftward swing later on, which was kind of predicted by some of the leftists within the IRA, they did have some valid criticisms of the organization as it was becoming, and this sort of culminates in another bloody split in 1974 where the Irish National Liberation Army splits off. And that's where a lot of my paper is situated, in focusing on the Irish National Liberation Army and their political arms and their leader, Seamus Costello. And to do that and to really get into their heads, I used techniques that I learned at Watsonville's in the Heart, a project I've been interning for the past year or two, and analyzing newspapers. And my amazing professor pointed me to an online archive that really has a lot of the publications from this period, and that allowed me to really, these are biased sources, but it really allowed me to get into their heads and see what kind of ideas they're grappling with, and I really wanted to let the sources sort of speak for themselves. So some of the big things that I got from that was, one, they had some great graphic designers. I mean, that's a theoretical journal from 1971. I also got a great album out of one of the newspapers, some good music. But also seeing how people were thinking both within and without the confines of Republican ideology, because it becomes the sort of prevailing way of thinking about the situation. But there were people that were, saying, they're seeing the flaws that sort of came with working within the Republican ideology that had sort of started the IRA. And I went in sort of thinking that there would be a distinction between the North and the South in sort of their leftist groups, but really there was, but not in the way I was thinking, and that people were thinking about this as a problem of all of Ireland, but more so that it was sort of the direct colonization in the North and indirect colonization in the South, and that it was just sort of two faces of the same problem, which was British imperialism. And also these people were just thoroughly internationalist, looking to Vietnam, which was just winning the communists in Vietnam were just winning the war, also looking to the FLN in Algeria, as much as they were looking at groups like the ETA, the Basque separatists, and other sort of ethnic militant groups. But sort of through all of that, what I really got out of it, and the biggest thing that I saw, there's Seamus Costello, by the way, was that being involved in the Troubles and also just being sort of embroiled in the conditions of Northern Ireland from before even the Troubles started, before the leftward swing in the early 60s, really enabled this up-and-coming group of militants to have a really unique perspective and really revolutionary ideas come out of all of this through being, again, embroiled in this violence, and it's kind of this reciprocal relationship. And they start dealing with really interesting ideas like, is the North a settler colonial? Like, can we think about this in terms of settler colonialism? So I think there's a lot of really interesting things that we can learn from these people, and they were people. And that's about all the time I have, but I'll leave you with this quote that they pulled from Marx that they sort of adapted to themselves, that all political groupings are merely moments in the history of the working class. So, thank you.
I'm super embarrassed to say that I forgot to do one of the most important things, which is to thank the history department staff who put this whole thing together. It's really but also Anna Turner and Stephanie Hinkle had all done a great job in putting this together, the food, the room, the reservations, and everything. So thank you very much, Haley, who is the one who's in here. I think we have the two of them. Okay. So our next speaker is Ethan Waldo. Ethan also won the Leonard Peterson Award in the department, and a Chancellor's Award and a Dean's Award, and did this paper with Mark Matera. Mark was also... Ethan's paper is entitled Regulation of Prostitution in 19th Century Paris, Effects of Urbanization on Sexual Institutions. So I'm going to pop out of there, and then you should be able to find yourself here. Okay, good.
Today I'm going to talk about my paper, which is titled The Effects of Hospitalization on Sexual Institutions. The first question anyone asks me when I mention my paper is, how did you end up on this topic? So I want to start by trying to answer this question. Long story short, I studied abroad and I couldn't stop talking about it. Jokes aside, I spent last summer studying in Paris, where I took a few French classes and a history class that focused exclusively on the city. One thing we talked about was hospitalization, which was an urban development project that forced lower-class communities to the outskirts of Paris by destroying these cramped lower-class neighborhoods and transforming them into the grand boulevards and cookie-cutter buildings Paris is known for today. So going into the seminar, I knew that I wanted to dive further into hospitalization, so I started there. Pretty early on in my research, I ran across this passage in Decaux Samir's book, Dividing Paris, where she explains that there is a large gap in the story of hospitalization when it comes to working-class women. Since the seminar was focused around the study of sexuality and urban environments, many of our early readings covered prostitution. So I decided to look into that. And I learned that in 19th century Paris, there were regulations enacted after concerns were raised about the morality surrounding practice and public health. A goal of these regulations was to stop the spread of syphilis by forcing prostitutes to register with local authorities and subjecting them to mandated health screenings. In practice, these regulations gave police the ability to surveil and track the movement of these women effectively. I wanted to start by answering two main questions. How successful were these regulations in their original goals, and how did urbanization affect these institutions? And this is what I found. These regulations were successful in their primary goal of limiting the movement of prostitutes. Police conducted raids on busy streets, arresting dozens of unregistered women a night, and the only way for these women to avoid persecution was to work within registered brothels. The amount of these establishments grew significantly during the first half of the 19th century, allowing for police to surveil and track the movement of these women effectively. They also failed to stop the spread of syphilis. These women found effective ways to hide signs of syphilis using makeup, and they spread this knowledge throughout the community, which allowed them to circumvent the mandated health screenings, rendering them useless. Lastly, they failed at hiding sexual institutions from the public eye. Key identifiers such as colored lanterns allowed these brothels to be more visible to the clientele than ever before, cementing themselves into the public space. The process of hospitalization destroyed many of the brothels that were opened during the first half of the 19th century, many of which could not reopen due to the high price of property in these new neighborhoods. The closure of many of these brothels forced many prostitutes to become independent again, negating the original efforts to enclose these women off of the streets. Although this did improve the condition of lower-class prostitutes, the infrastructure introduced during hospitalization, such as streetlights, allowed these independent women to attract clients easier. Furthermore, a new type of brothel allowed these independent women to rent out individual rooms where they could conduct their business. Overall, hospitalization allowed these women to have more freedom of how and who they served without being under the control of someone else. Many of the brothels that remained open were high class, aimed to serve the upper and middle classes moving into the newly constructed neighborhoods. The demand for luxury and extravagance increased with this new clientele, forcing the women working in these brothels to cater to these taboo desires, without seeing any increase in living conditions or pay. Many of these brothels continued operating until 1946, when they were officially banned in France. I want to end with this image of a high-class brothel in 1900. Following hospitalization, the remaining sexual institutions evolved to meet and reflect the luxury and extravagance that their wealthy clientele demanded. Thank you.
I got to go to Vienna for the first time last summer, and this picture reminds me of the fact that it was a lovely city, but not my aesthetic. Practicing more forgotten thanks, I want to thank Kate Jones, Ann Krebs, and Kat Gutierrez for being on the undergraduate education committee with me and reading all these papers and judging them. It's been a pleasure working with them all. Okay, so we are in the last of our papers in panel 1, and after this presentation we'll have a Q&A time. And so our next paper is by Bronwyn Eyre. Bronwyn won the Department Award in Indigenous History and the Dean's Award, and did this work with Amy Lonetree, our fantastic professor sitting far in the back. So I want to Bronwyn is speaking on the subject of silent soldiers, uncovering the stories of Indigenous nurses in the First World War.
Alright, hi, I'm Bronwyn. I just wanted to say thank you so much for inviting me to present today. I feel very lucky to talk about my research with all of you because I think my housemates are pretty sick of hearing me. So my paper looks into the lives and legacies of Native American women who worked as nurses in the First World War. And as of right now, there are 13 counted and confirmed nurses. This is coming from researchers Aaron Fair and Dr. Daniel Littlefield at the Sequoia National Research Center. They've acknowledged that 13 is not like a set number. It's just the list that they have right now of like confirmed people. And their work informed a huge part of my paper and part of the reason why I pursued this topic in the first place. So today I really just wanted to focus on some stories from the women themselves. So starting with Cora Elm of the Oneida community in Wisconsin. She attended the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, followed by the Protestant Episcopal Hospital Nursing Program in Philadelphia. Cora's student records indicate that she was a remarkable student. However, they also reveal a very disturbing level of federal interest in her success in the boarding school system. In a letter from the school superintendent to the girls' agent for the Department of the Interior outing system, he writes about her admission to the nursing program as forging a new path for other Carlisle girls just like her. And although he has nothing but good things to say about her work, the language that he uses very clearly identifies her and her peers with the Carlisle institution rather than their respective tribal communities or as individuals. So after graduating from the program, she would go on to work at that same hospital and even became a head nurse of an entire ward. In 1917, she enlisted in the Army Nurse Corps, and by the spring of 1918 was deployed to France, where she served at a base hospital through the end of the war. Although she didn't return home right when the war ended, she actually continued working overseas and even went on to work in the Baltic states and during the Allies' intervention in the Bolshevik Revolution, which was an interesting detail that I found. Next, I wanted to talk about Lucienne Lavoie. She's not one of the 13 on that list because she wasn't officially enlisted in the Army Nurse Corps. She was a volunteer nurse, but she attended the Haskell Institute in Kansas and after graduating moved to Washington, D.C. to work for the Department of the Interior. Shortly after arriving in the fall of 1918, the influenza epidemic started spreading very rapidly through the camps there, so on top of wartime casualties, they just needed a lot of help with treating diseased soldiers as well. So she was transferred to nearby Camp Humphreys to work as a volunteer nurse. In a letter to her friend back home, she describes very chaotic working conditions and just like very high rates of mortality around her. That letter actually was one of the original documents that I came across in starting this research, and I was just so fascinated by it. I find her to be a very compelling writer, and the way that she very seamlessly transitions between confrontations with mortality and like stories about cute boys from the camp, I just found so like humanizing, and I think it's an important reminder of just how young she was going in to this situation, and also that she maintained her agency in how she reacted to these major historical events colliding around her. And just throughout my paper, I talk a lot about the historiography of early 20th century Native American life because it is a very underreported subject. And writers at the time saw Native American civilization as sort of a civilization in decline. In 1913, for example, Joseph K. Dixon published his book, The Vanishing Race, in which he chronicles the downfall of a once great human race. And in it, although he's sympathetic to Native Americans, he does not show really any respect for them as active participants in modern life. Because of that, I think that it is so important to share the stories of women like Cora and Lucient, because they contradict that narrative that he established. I think that both women are very remarkable and very talented. I also think that several federal institutions took advantage of that talent for their own gain. And I hope that in spending time unpacking the complexities of their lives will be one small step towards recognizing the Native American contributions to the country as we know it today.
If Ian and Ethan could both come up here now for a question and answer period, that would be wonderful. And while they're coming up, it's a nice opportunity for me to say that in that divisional conversation about the awards for deans and chancellors, all three of these papers were singled out by colleagues outside of history as being fascinating and noteworthy. So we have about we have about 10 minutes for some questions. So does anyone in the audience have some questions for any of our three presenters today? Alice.
So thank you for these terrific papers. I'm just wondering if each of you could talk a little bit more about how you found your sources, since we have a lot of students here who may be thinking about starting research projects. And you mentioned that one of your faculty mentors led you to the newspapers that you use, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more, each one of you, about how you found those sources.
Well, yeah. My professor graciously gave us sort of a list of different places to start. And yeah, a lot of it was, I mean, Ron, when you brought up historiography, I was really trying to sort of grapple with, what secondary sources were saying and see where they might have been lacking. But I think my specific topic and what I was writing about really sort of necessitated going to what they were actually saying. And it's tough because doing Irish history, I can't physically access those archives, so the online archive that I found was really the best. And I could talk a long time about shortcomings in my paper, maybe a limited amount of sources, but I tried to work with what was available best, and it took a lot of reading through lots of newspapers, but it was fun.
Yeah, I kind of took the same approach where I followed the historiography and secondary sources listed, or primary sources listed and secondary sources. A lot of my sources were written by doctors in the 19th century that were calling for regulations and reforms to prostitution. So they were very biased sources in the French language, but I was able to use that to kind of paint a more complete picture.
Yeah, I had a similar process. I think I checked out a couple books from the library about Native Americans in World War I. One of them was by Susan Applegate Krause. That was a big one that I used a lot because she had actually spent a lot of time in the Dixon archives going through interviews that he, and like surveys that he conducted after World War I. And so obviously I couldn't access his archive, but she used it a lot in her book, and so that was very helpful. And then also, again, I focused on like letters between the girls and their like classmates and letters home, which I guess there's some pros and cons to this, but because they both attended boarding schools, they were pretty well like documented, at least during their time there. And, yeah, that's what they did.
Can I do that really quickly? Like I said, letting the sources talk for you, like, because like I didn't have so much, I just tried to like get as much as I could from the sources that I did have and really let them speak for themselves instead of like trying to use them to fit my conclusion. And also just anything I thought that was interesting, I tried to pursue and like, you know, go down that rabbit hole because it's fun.
Another question, yeah, Malaya.
Could each of you share a favorite story from your primary sources that you didn't get a chance to talk about during your short presentations? If you want.
I can start. Yeah, actually, so the letter that I brought up, that I was talking about for a bit, it's like this 8-page long letter, and I was so obsessed with it. She was just like so funny. She had so many funny stories, but in it she describes this whole like meet cute that she had with a soldier like on the train on the way to Washington D.C. and there was like a mix-up with their bags. They each brought the same bag, and like there was like they switched them, and then they found each other, and then they were going to the same exact place. And she only mentioned him. I think his name was Lieutenant Cantrell, I think is what she did. And I was just like so obsessed that I went off on a completely unnecessary tangent trying to like find out who it was. I think I ended up putting it in the footnotes of my paper, but I've narrowed it down to like one guy who I'm pretty sure it was from that was probably like the most fun part that I had.
I'm having a hard time thinking about fun stories with mine, but I do mention someone in my paper. Her name was Valerie Duran. She was a teacher that was getting accosted and arrested by French police that kind of showed how, like, overstepping, how the regulations affected all working class women, not just the people in the profession.
There's lots of interesting characters. There's one, I think the second picture I have, there's this really famous picture of and it's the first thing on my paper, of a man holding a gun with a starry plow flag in the background, and a lot of Republican ideology really centers around like symbols. And this guy was this guy named Joe McCann, who really becomes a symbol, and the starry plow flag is a big symbol too. But he was just a crazy character. He like was known for in the protests that sort of kicked off the Troubles. He like commandeered a police truck and like drove it into a canal. He also was known to like while he was wanted by the police, he walked around the British Army barracks with his like Irish wolfhound just to like show off to everyone that he could. He was crazy. There's a lot of other things about that one guy.
Thank you. I think we've got about 5-7 minutes for a break, but if you'd like to ask a question.
Yes, I have a question for Bronwyn. I also study universal law. I'm a grad student here in the department, and so I was super intrigued by your presentation. And I'm wondering, you mentioned that you were able to read more than just the one letter that you were able to speak about today. Wondering what kind of impressions you got about how the nurses felt about their nursing work and their sort of role within these hospitals.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the last part?
Yeah. Sorry, I know the mask is muffling me. Just wondering what impressions you got from other letters that you read from these nurses on sort of how they saw themselves within these hospital spaces and how they viewed their medical work.
Yeah. I didn't really have time to talk about it in the presentation, but I think I talked about it a little bit in my paper. I know that in Lucian's letter that I was looking at a lot, she definitely, like the language that she used referring to herself and the other Indigenous nurses that were also working there, she is like very clear that she does not necessarily like identify with the other white nurses who are working at the camp. She also is very aware that like Native American nurses are usually not allowed to be nurses, or had up to that point not been allowed. and I think they were making exceptions because they just needed so much help at the hospitals. I think generally though, she seemed like very excited to be helping. I mean, she like moved to Washington DC to work for the Department of the Interior, like she was working for the government. I think she saw it as like a very good opportunity, and like she just felt like she was helping out her country a little bit. I know she mentioned that she didn't like how long the shifts were, and I don't think that she liked the work specifically, but she was there with like a group of other girls from her school, and I think they were all sort of helping out as nurses and finding ways that they could.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Why don't we take a 5-minute break, and then we'll be back for panel. All right, we have 3 more papers, 3 more chances to hear of students having research experiences and finding great stuff and having a chance to present to you all. I'm really glad that we have these opportunities. Our first paper in the second part is by Jacob Press, and it's called "You Just Take It for Granted When You're Growing Up, Filipino Cockfighting in the Pajaro Valley." And in this one, we get to acknowledge 2 sources of support here. Again, the wonderful Amy Lone Tree and the Watsonville is in the Heart program. So this
Hello everyone, welcome for coming. My name is Jacob Press, and I wrote this paper during Amy Lone Tree's winter quarter class last quarter, and it is called "You Just Take for Granted When You're Growing Up, Filipino Cockfighting in the Pajaro Valley." My inspiration for this paper came from my internship with Watsonville is in the Heart. And Watsonville is in the Heart is a community-engaged research project that works in collaboration with the Tobera Project, which was founded in 2020 by Aurora Macio. And with the Watsonville is in the Heart, I was able to use their digital archive, which launched a couple years ago. And my experience with that as a curatorial research assistant has really helped me understand archives like for local communities, because I have a passionate understanding that we are public servants as both history undergrads and also as history professors and as a department in general. And I think it's our part to take the chance to look at our own local communities and really learn from them and understand their memories and create like a collective memory around that history. So that was really what inspired me and drove me to make this this paper about cockfighting in the Pajaro Valley in the Watsonville community. So a lot of the research was focused around the transnational tie, which is cockfighting is the national sport of the Philippines, and how it basically was able to come to the United States through the Manong. And the Manong is are the Filipino farm workers that came to the Watsonville community up and down the West Coast and Hawaii as well. And Manong is a term of endearment, meaning uncle or older brother. So it was a very important term that they used to refer the descendants to refer to their other uncles and this collective family and their fathers as well. So with that in mind, it's also a creation of masculinity and community around this cockfighting, which is, as you guys may know, is a brutal sport. But in that brutal sport, there is a juxtaposition of how it created a care through the rooster and also care for the social event of cockfighting. So my research for this project really engaged with, as I said earlier, with the Watsonville is in the Heart digital archive. And with that archive, I was able to find a plethora of oral histories, a lot of family photographs, family heirlooms as well. And with those oral histories, I was able to find pieces about cockfighting. And through those cockfighting excerpts, I was able to just like create like a story of like how cockfighting was able to both inform the people, like the descendants, but also transform the community around cockfighting. Because cockfighting itself is a criminalized activity. So it's had to be underground in some way. So there isn't as much like talk about it, and the only real talk about it in like through literature or through like newspapers is through the local newspapers. So I use the Santa Cruz Sentinel, I use the Evening Poweronian in Watsonville, and the Salinas Morning Sun to talk about how cockfighting was both a criminalized activity, and from that criminalized activity it came to be a socialized event that was preyed upon by a lot of police activity. But through those oral accounts, I was also able to find that they paid off the police through these accounts too. Yeah, and I was also able to connect to the phone, or connect to the community members through phone interviews. And this was actually kind of a late stage in the process too. It was like towards the finals week, and then I got a call from Roy Racio, who is the head of the Bear Project, and got in connection with a lot of important members of the community to have an over the phone interview to put into the paper as well. So, and that really reflected also the care, and that's how important it is to the Watsonville community, because they reached out to me to help create this wonderful research project. And another important thing to note is how this paper changes the narrative of the Manong, and not just objects of labor, but also a community. And within that community, there's families, there's friends, there's all these ties around cockfighting, and how it became not just like a criminalized activity, but it became a part of their pastime as a bachelor society. And it was very important for them to find these times to find leisure. One of the sources I really want to highlight for you guys today is Manor Simmons' both oral history and my phone interview with him. Manor Simmons is a graduate of UC Irvine, and also he went to Stanford as well, so he's very well educated. He was also the first Asian American mayor of Watsonville. So he has a very big tie to cockfighting, and he claims it in his own phone interview and some parts of his own oral history interview of how it is part of his self-identity as being courageous. Because in the cockfight, it usually lasts around 2 to like maybe 10 seconds, because they use spurs, like metal spurs, to attach to these roosters. So it ended very quickly, and it was a brutal sport. But a lot of the time, the rooster would come out and just be the underdog, literally, and just like win the fight. And that really inspired him to be like the cock in the fight, being able to win. So he has a lot of these pictures of his father holding the rooster. As you can see, like you can see how proud this man looks holding his prize-fighting rooster. And kind of that symbolizes a lot of the community around cockfighting in Watsonville, about how they saw it as not just like their own roosters, but how it could symbolize their own masculinity in the fight, and also the care and the socialization that went around these cockfights. And it was also around this time, like in the phone interview, that he also revealed to me that he actually was at a police raid when this cockfight happened, and how he was separated from his father. And now that kind of like changed his perspective of just like the community and coming together, because they were able to meet up at a restaurant called Philippine Gardens to have them reconnect with his family. So it just kind of brought like a perspective of these events, not just being from like, you know, the Manong, but also the descendants as well, and how that affected every part of the community. So for the future research of this project, I would like to engage in more oral histories to find out more about cockfighting within the Filipino community, but also in the perspective of the community members in California, and also my own research with a digital exhibition, which is how this paper is being transformed into more accessible and for the public. Yeah. All right. Thank you all for listening.
One of the many wonderful things about this event is that we can see the great work that's being done both in the community-oriented projects, but also in our senior seminars, which are actually not senior seminars, they're seminars for students at any level to take. So there's a lot of great research going on here, including our next paper by Mia Mislan, called Sex Work and Prostitution in the American Occupied Philippines, which was done in a seminar, again, with the ever-accomplished Mark Matera. So, yeah.
Hi, Hi everybody, I think I wrote my name pronunciation wrong. I'm Maya Misling, and today I'll be talking about my essay titled Sex Work and Prostitution in the American Occupied Philippines. This paper started off partially based on my experiences as an Asian woman. I wanted to find the roots of the sexualization of Asian women. From that, I thought about prostitution throughout Asia, particularly sex tourism, and I thought that would be a good base to start my research with kind of one of my leading questions: what are the roots of sex tourism? And this is kind of going backwards in my paper, but I wanted to point out the modern relevance, which is just that in many of the places where the American military had their bases, they also had a very high demand for prostitution. So now in some of the cities that I list here, such as Angeles City, Clark Air Base, and Subic Naval Base, there still is a very large and flourishing prostitution sector. And this is directly because of the American military presence. The temporal scope for my paper covers the American occupation of the Philippines, which starts in 1898 with the end of the Spanish-American War and ends in 1946 after World War II. And most of the sources that I rely on were largely secondary sources. It's really hard to, I really wanted to look at personal documents, like diaries, narratives. There's just a language barrier and it breaks my heart, but for most of the other primary sources I had to look at, they were government communications and documents, and then a film from 1964 called Hang on Pierre, which is also about the experiences of local Filipino women creating relationships with American GIs, and really it's about kind of how these relationships were so based on the time that the GIs were coming, and so it's kind of a beautiful, like, I don't know, people are so in love with each other and then they have to devastatingly leave. Yeah, I focus on the methods carried out by the American officials in prostitution. Lots of this is similar to Ethan's paper. Lots of photo identification, a primary source that I'll show later. Yeah, there were physical exams of women. It's very intrusive and very horrifying. And I argue that the assertion of new and oppressive ideas of gender and sexuality by colonial governments continue to harm and hurt Filipino people today, as I mentioned, with sex tourism. I already gave you guys a really brief history of the Philippines, but what I want to highlight from here is this enforcement of benevolent assimilation. These ideas were based on Filipinos being animalistic, childish, and they thought that the men were feminized, and this was used as justification to implement a lot of American institutions in the Philippines. And with this, they were able to have a very strong hold over the ideological mindsets of Filipinos and the way that they interact with each other. Another really important thing to mention is the interactions between American soldiers and Filipino people were heightened. Often what happens is American soldiers come into more I forget the word, rural regions. They destabilize the populations, they kill their animals, there's no more agriculture, and with this, people are forced to move into more urban centers. You don't have a way to support yourself, and so lots of women are being sent to cities, they send money back to their family, and they're just forced into prostitution. And with this, I wanted to look at this primary document. Like I said, I really could only rely on American documents because they were in English. I use this as an example of government efforts to control prostitution. I don't know if you can see this here, but in the first paragraph, they write, "Houses of prostitution have become a necessity." And so this is a military doctor writing to a marshal general in Manila. And so this is them saying prostitution is a necessity. It's not in the hands of American military officers, and with this they say we need to control it, we need to make these spaces within our urban centers to focus all of the prostitutes, and it's essentially the creation of red light districts where people continue to solicit prostitution, of course. And yeah, also as I mentioned, physical exams, photo identification. Part of this also was really wrapped up in this fear that Filipino women were infecting all of the men, they were making the military less effective. So yeah, this is also just the threat of Filipino women through demonizing kind of their sexuality, when really it is kind of projections of needs that just are very unfair. And with that, I'm going to conclude my presentation. Shout out to the Watsonvilles and the Hart team. Shout out to Ethan. Thank you, Professor Karen and Professor.
One correction to Maya. Maya,
Yes?
you did not write your name in terms of pronunciation. My brain locked into a Japanese mode, and so I'm sorry. I did make the mistake of pronouncing your name. So thank you very much for that great presentation. Our final presentation is a trio who worked together on a project in Elaine Sullivan's class. And the trio are Jackson Young, Isabella DuBlois, and Valerie Symes. And the project is A Night in Harlem, mapping the nightclubs of 1930s Harlem.
Okay, good morning everyone. My name is Isabel. And the platform we use to create A Night in Harlem is Story Maps. So we knew starting out for A Night in Harlem, we obviously wanted to focus on jazz in Harlem, but that's pretty broad for a 5-week time limit. And so luckily Jackson was able to locate this map. Well, it's an illustrated map by E. Sims Campbell that shows the block stretch between Lenox and 7th Avenue and the jazz venues and clubs that were popular within that area in 1930. And so our team decided that we wanted to digitally recreate this map and show the spatial relationships between these venues. But we quickly realized that traditional methods of research were just not going to cut it. We ran into significant roadblocks by looking at places like JSTOR, and so we realized we needed to turn away from JSTOR, and we needed to start looking at tax records. We were looking at the sites for venues that are still around. We were looking at community blog posts of people that live in this area that are talking about the importance of these venues, and we were also looking at leaflets from these venues, from shows and productions they put on to kind of piece together a cohesive story about these communities.
Okay, I was gonna demo the map, but it looks like,
Do you guys want to try to open it on another browser?
yes.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. It's okay. Please hold.
There we go.
Sorry about that. Oh, just give it a second to reconnect.
Okay, so here's the map by Campbell, showing that stretch between Lenox and 7th Avenue.
Yeah, so as Isabel already mentioned,
I don't know if you can tell from this map, but it's not necessarily geographically accurate. They kind of bunch all of the clubs into one little area, so our goal was to situate all these clubs into their actual geographical location. All right, and so this was our map. And we divided each of the venues because, as we said, our research method was a little unorthodox. We didn't have the best sources to depend on. So our green pins are for the ones that we were able to more thoroughly research. And then we have red pins over here for venues that didn't have the best resources. We could basically only verify that they existed. So you could outplace those. And then we have blue for ones we were able to research but not as thoroughly. So I'll bring this up. We also created an outline, a great outline of the borders of Harlem in which these clubs are situated. And then we also wanted to add some auditory and visual elements, so I'll just go through one of those right now. So let me open this. Okay, I can't open it all the way, but we have an image, and then we kind of include what we were able to find through our research, a quick summary. I won't go through all of them because we don't have that much time. And then we also included links to live recorded audio from those venues. And then also something interesting that we were able to find as from mapping this, as we know, it was all in one little area, but as you'll notice, a lot of these are bunched into one area and then others are in other areas. What I was able to find was that the Savoy Club, for example, and the Cotton Club, these are more bigger venues, and these ones over here are for, I think there were smaller hubs for the Black community. And another thing that I also noticed, if you guys already know, maybe the Cotton Club, a super famous club, this was actually known to exoticize the Black community. They kind of use Black entertainers as things to gawk at for the white community. So I think just the fact that it's kind of separated from these bigger hubs of clubs says a lot, actually, about the venues themselves. And then as for these green ones, we went into greater detail, which Jackson will actually take us through.
So the one that I wanted to go a little deeper dive into today is Tilly's Chicken Shack. Not super historically relevant, not a whole lot going on there, but I feel like it is pretty emblematic of why this research is super important. So it was started by Tilly Fripp, who was a Black woman who moved from Philadelphia to Harlem to start her chicken shop. This is a photo of it today. It is now Bill's Place, ran by a man named Bill, who runs a jazz club out of there now, so you can still go down there and get some food and listen to some good music on the weekends. But Tilly, I'm not too sure if Tilly Fripp's fire suppression system was a little weak or if the universe had something against her, but 2 of her chicken shack locations burned down. But the community was ecstatic to have her return in the late 70s, come back to Harlem and start again. We found a little biscuit recipe here on one of the blogs, which still catalogs the same recipe that Tilly used to that day. And then here is a photo of Bill playing saxophone in the same room in which people played back in the 40s. So I feel like this work is incredibly important. The system of oppression that came out after the Civil War and lasted legally until the 60s and 70s and then continued much longer after that was oppressively horrible. But you would be a fool to believe that these people stopped their lives and didn't try and make something personally meaningful out of them. And if whether that was Tilly moving from Philadelphia to start a chicken shack or Bill reclaiming his childhood and kind of keeping this thing going, then people continue, just as people today struggle under the yoke of oppression. We still continue. And then on that same vein is it's something that is seen as a source of trauma for many can be a big source of pride for others. Bill recalls quite fondly the time when he used to go around and hear instruments coming out of every window and see Black families playing music together. So it's super important to kind of still connect back to this, even though it's not historically relevant. It still matters to these communities where they come from. So.
Jacob and Maya can come back up for some Q&A, and this time I'm going to stand here because this might be in the off-screen, so you guys might be able to go ahead. So we have time for a couple questions. Yes, Ian.
So I actually, sorry YouTube, for the mapping people, I've been working on a mapping project with these two and some other people, and I think there are a lot of parallels. So I kind of wanted to ask, you just went over a lot of, like, I think it seems to me like a big takeaway from it, but I guess in doing the project, could you talk a little bit about how it like changed your perspective on what you already knew? Like, yeah, what are just some of the really big things you came away with?
I can take it, yeah. So definitely the predominant narrative is that segregation was rampant through these areas and that like there wasn't a whole lot of intermingling, but that's just definitely not the case. Like we saw many times that while predominantly it was black people in these spaces, white people came in and were enjoyed the same way. They enjoyed the same music, you know, we can all hear the same thing and enjoy it. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff like that in these small cases that challenge that predominant narrative. And I feel like that's important to kind of see sometimes.
And then I have something to add, and that is, I talked about a little earlier about how our research process was pretty unorthodox. I've never experienced a project like that where I was very much not relying on secondary sources, but really like going on the ground and seeing what people had to say like for the time. Because we were talking about like when you go out, you're not writing things down like in a primary source document. You're with your friends, you're with your family, you're having fun. And so it was just really, I think, a new experience to kind of have to dig through a wide variety of information that was not all in like somewhere like JSTOR or Google Scholar, and then have to piece it together in a cohesive story. And it led me to find some really cool things, like the venue I focused on, which was Lafayette Theater, put on an all-black production of Macbeth that was directed by Orson Welles, and there's live footage from it that I was able to watch, which I thought was really cool. And it's on the site if anyone wants to see it. Shameless promo.
Yeah, great.
Question for Jacob. Thank you all for the papers. This was a great panel. I was curious, you talked about one of the things you found important about studying the cockfighting was that it sort of presented a more well-rounded narrative of the community you were studying, so that there was sort of a stereotype portrayal, and that this allowed you to see and present a more sort of well-rounded look at a community. And I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit on the stereotype portrayal, like what are the ways you've seen this community presented in the media or in the historical record that you were trying to push back against?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the first part of the paper, I talked about sports and nationalism and how the U.S. came to the Philippines and represented cockfighting as a way of leisure, but they found it as like a way of kind of making it lazy. Like it was a lazy way to spend your time, and it didn't really produce anything. They compared it to baseball all the time because that was the U.S. sport, like, you know, the pastime. So they compared it to that a lot in the newspapers, and also the photograph I had for the inspiration slide that was shown like through photography. If they're like, look at the captions like a Native American, or was it the Native Filipinos? Like look how they spend their time like cockfighting, rather than actually doing something productive with their time. But I kind of pushed back against that and claim it as like a space of community and a space that shows their traditional Filipino values rather than like something that is brutal and a place of crime. And then also later in the 1930s with Prohibition, even later afterwards, there's like some raids that are claimed to be like the biggest like alcohol raids and cockfights. So there is kind of a little nugget of truth to like having those spaces as like places where like people colluded, but it wasn't really in a space that would like breed crime. It was a place where people would go to hang out after working in the fields for 7 to 6 days a week, and they really wanted to let off some steam through cockfighting. And there are other leisure activities as well, which involve gambling, which is a big part of cockfighting, which I didn't really mention. But I pushed back in the way of just creating a new narrative of the community rather than one that's kind of chastised, I guess.
Jeanette.
I have a question for all the panelists, but maybe beginning with Maya. And it's the same question. All the papers were talking about cultural history. All of them address themes of power, resistance, identity. So I was wondering what aspect of cultural history became most important for you when you were writing the paper, researching and writing the paper?
I think for me, what I tried to focus on the most would be about changing ideas of gender and sexuality. And I think it's kind of hard because American occupation comes after Spanish colonization. So it's not going to be like we have these like native Filipino ideas of gender, of sex, which we have found research on. Like there's definitely, we know of what they look like, and it's not rooted in monogamy. I think often it's kind of matrilineal and stuff like that, but it's not really going to be like the Americans came and they changed everything. I think it was a really gradual process starting with Spanish colonization, I don't know, having interactions with local people. I think people talk a lot about kind of like mestizo Filipinos. But yeah, I think just what I really wanted to take out of this was the idea of kind of victimizing women while also putting them at blame for your sexual urges. I think it was more, because I wanted to start with, like a Filipino perspective on everything. I just didn't have the resources for that, and so I think what I really tried to focus on instead was a shift in the American perspective of Filipino people.
I think for us, for our project specifically, it was more so on preserving that cultural history. Because as we said, a lot of our sources, very unorthodox. It's a lot of community blog posts. We looked into tax documents. I even looked at a menu from one of these sources. So it's very telling, just the fact that we didn't have JSTOR, just very more scholarly sources to look at and depend on. So for us, it's definitely more on the side of preserving a history and piecing it together in a way that I guess for this situation hasn't really been done before, or at least very well. So I think for our project, that was our focus.
And I feel like kind of on a similar vein of preserving the culture, of just how cockfighting was preserved through community engagement as a memory, because it was passed down through different generations. To have these different techniques through the care or through even metal making. There was a blacksmith in the community that would make blades, Tomi Tabayo, and he would be flown around the country tying blades to roosters. But that the act of cockfighting itself is a resistance to the legal criminality of it all. It's a legal consciousness of how people think cockfighting is a brutal and terrible sport. I was telling my grandma, oh, I'm writing this crazy paper, and she's like, I don't want to hear anything about it. I don't want to hear anything about it. She immediately was like, oh, I'm not going to talk about that with her. So it just kind of depends on the cultural aspect of where you're from. So that old resistance, but it's also resistance against erasure of a third space in some way, because it was the creation of a social aspect of their community, which could be picked up and put anywhere really. It can be on the sand dunes, it can be in Mount Madonna up in the mountains, it can be in the redwoods, it can be anywhere really. So it really was showing the aspect that it's a rural sport, and how it basically resisted the exclusionary acts that were presenting as Filipinos for anti-miscegenation, so they couldn't mingle with other communities, white women and stuff. But it was also just resistance of this discrimination. So they could create their own community, which other people came to, not just the Filipinos, but it was a space of Chinese, a lot of white people, a lot of Mexicans came as well. So it was a hodgepodge of different people and cultures and food as well at those events.
Right. Do we have any more questions? Alice?
Okay. Sorry to take up so much time. So I have a comment and then a question. Because for if you're interested in continuing this and looking for legacy, I'd encourage you to look at Gabriella, because that's a diasporic organization, right, that looks at and provides a critique of, and you're aware of it, right, militarization and sex trafficking and sex tourism in the Philippines. And for Jacob, you mentioned the impact of the phone interview that you did, and I noticed in your presentation that it came I'm assuming it came after an oral history that Steve McKay conducted. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that process, because one of the things that oral historians are very conscious of is the need to establish and maintain trust and pay attention to the dynamics and the relationship between the person who's asking the questions and the narrator. And especially when you're dealing with a public figure and the fact that it was criminalized, right? You have to be very conscious of trying to protect the rights of the person that is providing you with the information. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that process.
Yeah, so for the community members that wanted to talk to me, they reached out on a phone interview. Like, it was first like the connection through Roy Racio, who has a lot of the community members on dial. Just like sent them my contact info to them, so they called me and reached out to me to talk to them about cockfighting. And there were some community members that didn't really want to have certain aspects of their relationship with cockfighting being shared, like some of the tools, like the blades I used, like in the paper. They didn't really want to have that be used in their name under it. So I respected that aspect of like legalizing that still like a criminalized activity, and also just the way in which I asked just like, hey, like, can I use this certain parts of it, and like I was made sure that it was like on their respect, you know, and how the oral history is just like it's more a professional setting. So I recognize how like a phone interview is less formal, and it's like there's other factors of just like it's over the phone and not over person or over Zoom, and there's not like a legal consent form that you send. It's just something that is kind of like, you reach out to me, I'm going to talk to you about this, and I'm going to ask if it's okay if I can use certain parts to use. And Emmanuel Gosselin, yeah, he was very, his phone interview was very similar to his oral history interview, like almost exactly like word for word, which was very interesting. But there was some stuff that came out, like Lorraine that happened that was not in his oral history interview. But it's about the collective memory. I feel like what's to be shared and what's not to be shared is still a very important aspect of the oral history community. Certain silences that are meant to be silent, and respecting that.
All right, well, I think I can speak for all the faculty when I say I always find these events really rejuvenating to see the work that the undergraduate students are doing, how fabulous it is, how varied it is. It reminds me that I still remember my own senior thesis with some clarity, so that was 40 years ago, so you can look 40 years in the future, you're probably going to be remembering this moment as well. So, and for anybody here who is a friend who is looking to their own opportunity to do some research in the future, I hope you take a lot of encouragement from this, because I think there's a lot of fantastic work that everybody can do these days, especially now. As Ian was pointing out, you can't go to Ireland necessarily, but there's a lot more stuff available to you nonetheless. So some great research opportunities for all of you coming up. Great work done by everybody who presented today, and thank you very much for coming.